In 1929, in a laboratory in Britain, a Hungarian physicist built a camera that could do something no camera had ever done before. It could see in complete darkness, and the reason he built it had nothing to do with letting one soldier find another in the night. Kálmán Tihanyi was the physicist, and the device was an infrared-sensitive electronic television camera, developed for a very specific and very defensive purpose, helping British anti-aircraft crews spot enemy bombers approaching in total darkness, long before those bombers came close enough to see with the naked eye. It worked by capturing infrared light invisible to human vision and converting it into a visible image, essentially letting a machine see wavelengths of light that human eyes simply couldn't detect on their own. Nobody was thinking about foot soldiers crouched in a field. They were thinking about the sky, and about giving air defense crews a few extra critical seconds of warning before an aircraft arrived overhead. Britain, however, didn't carry that early lead all the way to the battlefield. Tihanyi's image converter concept had come out of academic and industrial research rather than a dedicated military weapons program. And although the British Admiralty formally took over responsibility for infrared research in 1938, British efforts continued at a comparatively cautious pace through the early war years. Companies like Philips and EMI contributed further image converter development, but it saw only limited deployment compared to what was coming elsewhere. The nation that had planted the seed wasn't the one that got it into a soldier's hands first. That same basic idea, converting invisible infrared light into something a human eye could actually use, turned out to have a second life nobody at that Air Ministry lab had originally intended. Starting in 1935, the German electrical manufacturer AEG began developing its own infrared image converter technology, and unlike the British effort, German engineers gradually pushed the concept toward the battlefield itself, rather than the sky above it. Early versions were bulky. They were mounted on tanks and vehicles rather than carried by hand, built around large infrared searchlights paired with image converter tubes that let a crew see the invisible infrared beam bouncing back off anything it illuminated. By 1939, versions of this technology were already being fielded by the German military, making Germany the first nation to actually deploy night vision equipment in a real war. German engineers called the best documented of these systems Nachtjäger, or night hunter, a combination of an infrared searchlight and a corresponding infrared telescope mounted together on Panther tanks starting in 1943. A tank equipped this way could illuminate the battlefield with a beam completely invisible to the naked human eye. Anyone without matching equipment simply saw darkness. The tank's own infrared-sensitive telescope, meanwhile, could see everything that beam touched, while anyone without equivalent equipment saw only ordinary night. Testing continued through the war, refining exactly how the searchlight and viewing telescope needed to work together to give tank crews any real tactical advantage once night fell. Then, in 1943 and 1944, German engineers took the same fundamental idea and shrank it down small enough for a single soldier to carry. The result was called the Zielgerät 1229, better known by its code name, Vampir. It was a self-contained infrared sight built to attach directly to the Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle, pairing an infrared illuminator with a viewing scope, letting an individual infantryman aim and fire in total darkness at targets he could see clearly through the sight, even though anyone without one would have seen nothing at all. At least 200 units were built and issued before the war ended, arming Wehrmacht soldiers with a genuinely new kind of advantage on the Eastern Front, one their Soviet opponents didn't yet have equipment to counter. On the opposite side of the planet, an entirely separate branch of the same idea was developing in parallel, driven by a completely different military need. The United States had been tracking German infrared research since the late 1930s and pushed forward with its own version, resulting in devices called the M1 and M3, more commonly nicknamed the sniper scope and snooper scope. The enemy this time was different. Rather than mounting them on tanks facing German armor in Europe, American forces adapted the technology for infantry rifles and carbines, deploying it against Japanese forces fighting at night in the Pacific Theater. During the brutal opening week of the Okinawa campaign in 1945, infrared-equipped American riflemen reportedly accounted for roughly 30% of all Japanese casualties from small arms fire, a striking result from a technology that barely existed a decade earlier and had been deployed in fewer than 500 units total. Two nations, fighting two entirely different wars on two different continents, had independently arrived at the same basic answer to the same basic problem. Darkness no longer had to belong to whoever couldn't see through it. Neither side abandoned the concept once the war ended either. Throughout the late 1940s and into the Korean War, the U.S. Army worked closely with the Radio Corporation of America to refine the underlying image converter tubes, squeezing better range and image clarity out of technology that was still, fundamentally, the same active infrared approach the Germans had pioneered a decade earlier. Soldiers in Korea carried improved versions of the same basic sniper scope concept, still dependent on a searchlight beam that an alert, properly equipped enemy might eventually learn to detect. Every one of these early systems, German and American alike, shared the same fundamental weakness, and it was a serious one. They were active devices, meaning they depended on shining an actual beam of infrared light onto whatever they wanted to see. And that beam, while invisible to an ordinary human eye, could still be detected by an enemy equipped with the right receiving equipment. A soldier using one of these devices wasn't truly hidden. He had simply traded a beam of visible light for a beam of invisible light, and the moment either side developed detection equipment of its own, that particular advantage could vanish entirely. The real turning point came after the war. Engineers began working on a fundamentally different approach that eliminated the need for any illuminating beam at all. Rather than shining infrared light onto a target and capturing the reflection, this new generation of devices worked by amplifying whatever tiny amounts of ambient light already existed. Starlight, moonlight, distant artificial light, multiplying it thousands of times over until an otherwise pitch-black scene became clearly visible. Because these passive devices required no illuminator of their own, a soldier using one gave away nothing. There was no telltale infrared beam for an enemy to detect, no light source to spot from a distance, nothing but a quiet, unpowered lens gathering light nobody else in the area could see using at all. These passive light-amplifying devices, later classified as Generation 0 and Generation 1 night vision, entered real combat use during the Vietnam War, where American troops carried early starlight scopes into jungle terrain that had defeated countless earlier attempts at nighttime visibility. They were bulky. They were limited by today's standards. Even so, they represented a genuine leap beyond anything the previous generation of German and American infantry had carried. Technology that let a soldier see without simultaneously advertising his own position to anyone paying attention. Later generations refined the image intensifier tubes at the heart of these devices further still, adding components like micro-channel plates that dramatically improved image clarity and low-light performance, pushing the underlying concept closer and closer to the compact, reliable night vision equipment now considered standard across modern militaries worldwide. The generations that followed only sharpened this basic idea further. Generation 2 devices introduced those micro-channel plates in earnest, amplifying the number of electrons flowing through the tube before they struck the phosphor screen, and producing a noticeably brighter, sharper image, particularly around the edges of the lens. Generation 3 systems pushed the concept a step further still, replacing older photocathode materials with gallium arsenide, a change that boosted sensitivity and reliability enough to make the technology genuinely standard-issue equipment across most modern militaries, rather than a specialized tool reserved for a handful of snipers and tank crews. What had once required a truck-mounted searchlight visible for miles could now fit inside a pair of goggles barely heavier than a helmet, which brings this story to where it quietly sits today. A technology that began in a British laboratory built purely to help anti-aircraft crews watch an empty night sky for approaching bombers has become something almost unremarkable. A piece of equipment sold openly to hunters, campers, and hobbyists, mounted on home security cameras and carried as standard infantry gear in militaries around the world. Tihanyi's original camera was never meant to help one person find another in the dark. It was built to help a nation watch its own sky. Everything that followed, the tanks, the rifles, the jungles of Vietnam, and the ordinary consumer gadget sitting in a hunting store today, grew out of an idea originally built to look up, not down.